It started with something I almost ignored. Not a message, not a conversation, not even a specific moment. Just a small observation that appeared one evening while I was driving home. At first it seemed unimportant. The kind of thought that crosses your mind and disappears before you have time to examine it. But this one didn't disappear. It stayed. And the longer it stayed, the more I realized it had probably been there for years. That evening looked like most evenings. Work had ended quietly. People packed up their desks, exchanged the usual goodbyes, and moved toward the elevators with the slow collective rhythm of the end of a long day. I was one of the last people to leave the office floor. Not because I had extra work, just because I've always had a habit of staying a few minutes longer after everyone else goes. The building feels different when it empties. The noise fades. The air changes. And for a few moments you can hear the place breathing in a way you never noticed during the day. When I stepped outside, the parking lot was almost empty. A few cars remained under the streetlights. The sky had already turned dark, though there was still a faint trace of blue on the horizon. I unlocked my car and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine. It's a small ritual I've developed over the years. A few quiet seconds before re-entering the routine of the evening. Most of the time, I don't think about anything during those moments. But that night my attention drifted somewhere unexpected. I noticed the building across the street. Not the one I worked in. The one next to it. It was another office building, slightly older, with narrow windows that reflected the lights of the parking lot. I had seen it thousands of times, but that night something about it caught my attention. Specifically one window. On the third floor. There was a light on inside. That by itself wasn't unusual. People stay late at offices all the time. But what held my attention wasn't the light. It was the movement behind the window. Someone was inside, walking slowly back and forth across the room. Not quickly. Not with the restless pace of someone trying to finish work. More like someone thinking. Or waiting. I watched the figure for a few seconds. The person stopped near the window, then turned and walked across the room again. Back and forth. The movement repeated. And something about it felt strangely familiar. Not the person. I couldn't see them clearly enough for that. Just the motion itself. Then it hit me. The reason the movement looked familiar was because I had done the same thing many times. Walking slowly across a quiet room after everyone else had gone. Not because there was work left to do, but because something in my mind refused to settle. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking space. But as I drove past the other building, I glanced up once more at the lit window. The figure was still there, still moving slowly across the room. And for a brief moment, I wondered what they were thinking about. What kind of day leads someone to remain in an empty office long after everyone else has gone home? It was a strange thought. Not dramatic, just curious, but stayed with me during the drive home. The roads were mostly clear that night. Traffic moved smoothly through the intersections. The radio played quietly in the background, though I wasn't really listening to it. Instead, my mind kept returning to that window. That person walking slowly back and forth in the empty office. And eventually another thought appeared. A quieter one. One that made the earlier observation feel slightly more personal. What if someone had looked through the windows of my office on certain nights? What would they have seen? Would they have noticed the same thing? The slow pacing. The long pauses near the window. The way someone stands still for several seconds as if trying to understand something that refuses to explain itself. The thought made me smile slightly. Because I knew the answer. Yes, there have been nights like that. More than a few. I arrive home around the usual time. The house was quiet. It always is. I live alone, so the silence in the evening has a predictable shape. The faint hum of the refrigerator. Occasional cars passing on the street. The subtle creaks that houses make when the temperature changes after sunset. Ordinary sounds. The background noise of a stable life. I hung my jacket near the door and walked into the kitchen. Usually the first thing I do is turn on the television. Not because I'm eager to watch anything, just because the sound fills the room. But that night I didn't. Instead, I poured a glass of water and sat down at the table. The quiet didn't bother me. It felt familiar. For a while I just sat there thinking about the person in the office across the street. It was strange how such a small moment could stay in your mind. A stranger in a window. A few steps across a room. Nothing significant. And yet something about it had stirred a question I hadn't asked myself in a long time. What exactly had those quiet evenings in my own office been about? Not the work. The other part. The pacing. The waiting. The moments when you stare at the window longer than necessary. At first I told myself the answer was simple. Stress. Deadlines. ordinary work pressure. But the longer I sat there in the dim kitchen light, the less convincing that explanation felt, because I knew something else had been present during those nights. Something quieter, something harder to name. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the living room window. The street outside was calm. A street lamp cast a soft circle of light onto the pavement. A few houses down, someone turned off a porch light, and the street grew slightly darker. Standing there, looking out at the empty road, I suddenly understood why that image from the office building had stayed with me. It wasn't about the stranger walking across the room. It was about recognition, because sometimes you see a small piece of someone else's life from a distance, and it reminds you of something in your own life that you've been quietly avoiding. I returned to the kitchen and sat down again. The glass of water was still half full. The house remained silent around me, and slowly the thought that had started forming earlier in the evening became clearer. Those nights when I paced across my office after everyone else had gone home, I hadn't been thinking about work. Not really. I had been thinking about something else entirely, something I had never fully allowed myself to examine. I looked down at the table and traced a line along the wood grain with my finger. For years, I had assumed those moments were just part of being tired, part of being an adult. But now I wasn't so sure, because watching that stranger in the office window had made one thing suddenly obvious. When someone walks back and forth across an empty room long after the workday ends, they're usually not thinking about spreadsheets. They're thinking about their life. And sitting there in the quiet kitchen that night, I had the strange feeling that whatever question had been following me through those empty office evenings was finally starting to become impossible to ignore. The next day, I tried not to think about the window. I woke up at the same time, made the same coffee, stood in the same part of the kitchen while it brewed, looking out at the same section of street I had looked at every morning for years. Nothing about the routine felt unusual on the surface, but the image from the night before stayed with me. That lit office, that slow movement behind the glass, the quiet pacing of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and yet wasn't ready to leave. It had lodged itself somewhere in my mind, and now everything in the day seemed to connect back to it. Work began the way it always did. Emails had already stacked up by the time I sat down at my desk. The calendar on my screen was filled with the familiar small obligations of an ordinary weekday. Check-ins, budget updates, a meeting at 11, another at 2. Nothing dramatic, nothing especially difficult. Just the steady machinery of a life that continues because you keep feeding it hours. Daniel came by around mid-morning with a file tucked under one arm. "You staying late again tonight?" he asked. It was the kind of question that probably meant nothing. Casual office conversation. Something to say while passing from one task to the next. But it caught me more than it should have. "Maybe," I said. He nodded. "You know, one day they're going to lock you in here by accident." I smiled a little. That would save me the commute. He laughed and kept walking. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds, but it stayed with me long after he disappeared down the row of desks, because people had started noticing it. Noticing that I stayed behind after the work was done. Not every night, but often enough that it had become part of how they saw me. The quiet guy who took a little longer to leave. The one who sometimes sat in an empty office long after everyone else had gone home. I wonder how long that had been true. Long enough, probably, that I no longer thought of it as unusual. By noon, the day had settled into its normal rhythm. People moved between conference rooms, carrying coffee cups and laptops. Phones rang in short bursts. Someone near the printers was telling the same story twice, louder the second time, because a different coworker had just walked in and needed to hear it. I answered emails, attended a meeting, took notes I already knew I wouldn't need to read again. At one point, while someone was talking through a projection for next quarter, my attention drifted toward the window beside the conference table. From where I was sitting, I could see the other building across the street. The older one, the same one from the night before. In daylight, it looked smaller, less mysterious. Just another office building with narrow windows and slightly faded stone around the edges. Nothing about it suggested that, only 12 hours earlier, it had seemed to hold a small mirror up to my life. Still, my eyes stayed there longer than they should have. I found myself wondering which office it had been, which room, which floor, whether the person I saw had come back in this morning and continued the same routine without thinking about the previous evening at all. Maybe the moment meant nothing to them. Maybe they were just killing time before heading home. But it hadn't meant nothing to me. That was the problem. Or maybe not a problem. Maybe just a fact I had finally become aware of. The meeting ended. Chairs slid back. People collected their things. The room emptied. I was the last one to step into the hallway. That has always happened more often than I intend. Not because I move slowly, more because I don't feel the same impulse to rush from one place to another that other people seem to have. The rest of them leave meetings already leaning into the next thing. Lunch, another call, the drive home, a grocery stop, a child soccer practice. I leave them as if re-entering my own life takes a few extra seconds. I had never really thought about that until now. That evening I stayed later again. At first, I told myself it was practical. There really were a few things that needed finishing. A report to send. A couple of revisions on something my manager wanted before morning. And for the first hour, that explanation held. But then the work was done. The screens were dimmer. The hallways were quieter. Somewhere on another floor, a vacuum cleaner started up and then stopped. And still I remained. I stood by the window with my hands in my pockets, looking out at the parking lot below. A few cars were pulling away, one after another, red taillights gliding toward the street and disappearing into traffic. Across the road, in the older building, one light came on. Third floor. Almost the same place as the night before. This time the sight of it sent something sharper through me. Not fear, recognition. As if whatever I had noticed the previous evening was now returning, because it expected me to pay attention. I watched the window for a while. Again there was movement. Again the slow pacing across the room. Again the brief pause near the glass before the figure turned and crossed the office the other way. It was almost absurd how familiar it felt. And that's when something I had been circling finally became clear enough to admit. The pacing wasn't a habit of working late. It was a habit of not wanting to go home yet. I stood there with that thought longer than I should have. The office around me was quiet enough that I could hear the soft, electrical hum of my own computer behind me. Somewhere in the ceiling, the ventilation clicked as it shifted into a lower setting for the night. Not wanting to go home yet. The words felt too plain to carry as much weight as they did. Because it wasn't really about home. That was the strange part. There was nothing wrong with home. Nothing waiting there that I feared. No conflict. No tension. No visible problem at all. My house was comfortable. Clean. Predictable. The kind of place people describe as peaceful. So why had I spent so many evenings walking slowly across empty rooms, delaying the moment when I had to return to it? I shut down my computer and left the office floor without turning back. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. On the way down, I studied my reflection in the brushed metal of the elevator doors. It was distorted just enough to make me look slightly unfamiliar. Tired mostly. Not physically. More the kind of tired that comes from carrying the same shape of day for too long. When the doors opened onto the lobby, the security guard at the front desk looked up from his phone. "Late one," he said. "Yeah." He nodded. The way people do when they think they understand something simple. Maybe it was simple. Maybe I had just spent years making it more abstract than it needed to be. In the parking lot, I didn't sit in the car this time. I got in, started the engine, and drove straight out onto the road. But instead of heading home, I drove toward the diner again. I didn't even consciously decide to. By the time I realized where I was going, I was already turning into the lot. The neon sign in the window buzzed softly. A different waitress was working that night. Younger than the one from before, moving quickly between tables with the efficient half-focus of someone waiting for the shift to end. I took the same booth near the window. No one asked why I was there. That was part of what made the place feel useful. No one in a diner at that hour wants the full story. They only want your order. "Coffee?" the waitress asked. "Yeah. And food. Maybe later." She nodded and wrote it down. That was enough. I sat there watching the window reflect the inside of the room back at me. When it's dark outside, glass stops acting like a window and becomes a mirror. You don't look out through it anymore. You mostly see yourself, with bits of the street still faintly visible behind a reflection. The effect unsettled me a little. My own face floating over the blurred image of passing headlights. My shoulders slightly hunched. The lines around my eyes more visible in the diner light than they seemed at home. I wondered how many evenings of my life had passed with me positioned like that. In some quiet place, somewhere between going and staying, not fully inside either choice. The waitress brought the coffee. I thanked her. She moved away. The cup sat between my hands, radiating heat into my fingers. And for the first time since the thought had started forming, I asked myself something more direct. If I wasn't delaying the trip home because of home itself, then what exactly was I postponing? The answer came slowly. Not because it was complicated, because I didn't want it to be true. I wasn't avoiding the house. I was avoiding the moment when the day ended and there was nothing left to do except be inside my own life. Work gave structure to the hours. So did errands. So did noise. But home, once the night settled in, asked something else. It asked presence. And presence is harder than productivity. When there is nothing to manage, nothing to fix, nothing to answer immediately, you are left with yourself. And maybe that was what I had been quietly stepping around for longer than I realized. I thought back to those evenings in the office. The slow pacing, the unnecessary delays, the way I always found one more thing to revise, one more email to check, one more reason to stay 10 minutes later. Maybe I had called it work because work is easier to justify than uncertainty. Easier to explain than saying, I'm not ready for the quiet yet. The thought sat heavily in me, but also felt clean. For the first time, it explained something. Not everything, but enough. A man at the counter coughed into his fist and asked for the check. Someone near the door laughed at something I couldn't hear. The waitress leaned over to wipe down a table, then straightened and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Life continued around me in small, ordinary motions. And slowly, that familiar pressure in my chest changed shape again. It no longer felt like a question pressing inward. It felt like an answer arriving. Not wanting to go home right away had never really been about the route after work. It had been about the empty stretch of evening waiting on the other side of the front door. And whatever it was I had been pacing through in those offices, whatever thought had kept following me back and forth across the carpet, was now close enough to hear. I took another sip of coffee and looked at my reflection in the glass. Then, very quietly, I said the thing I had probably known for a long time, but hadn't let myself hear clearly until now. I don't know what to do with the quiet anymore. No one around me heard it. The sentence disappeared into the low noise of the diner almost immediately. But saying it aloud changed something, because now it existed in the room. And once a truth leaves your mouth, even softly, it becomes much harder to walk away from it. After I said it out loud, I didn't feel relief. That would have been too simple. I just sat there in the diner with both hands around the coffee cup, as if keeping them still might keep the rest of me from shifting too quickly. I don't know what to do with the quiet anymore. The sentence stayed with me after it left my mouth. Not because it sounded dramatic. It didn't. If anything, it sounded smaller than the feeling behind it. That was the strange part. Some truths arrive with almost no visible force. They don't crash through your life. They just settle into it and make everything around them look slightly different. The waitress passed by with a stack of clean glasses in her hands. Someone near the counter asked for more sugar. A truck moved slowly down the street outside, its headlights dragging across the window for a second and then disappearing. The world hadn't changed, but the shape of the night had. I stayed there longer than I intended to. Not because I was hoping for another realization, just because I wasn't ready to leave the place where the thought had finally taken a clear form. At some point, the waitress came back and stood beside the booth with the tired politeness of someone nearing the end of a shift. "You need anything else?" she asked. I looked up at her and almost said no automatically. That's what people usually say when they don't want to inconvenience anyone. But instead I glanced at the menu again, though I already knew I wasn't hungry. "No," I said after a second. "I'm good." She nodded, then hesitated very briefly. "You here waiting for somebody?" she asked. The question surprised me. I looked around the diner, as if the answer might be sitting somewhere in the room. "No," I said. "Just stopped in." She gave a small smile. "Long day." I could have answered the same way most people do. "Yeah, busy day, you know how it is." Instead I found myself saying something else. "Quiet one." She gave me a look I couldn't fully read, then nodded again. Sometimes those are the long ones. After she walked away, I sat there thinking about what she'd said. Sometimes those are the long ones. She was right. The loud days carry you. Meetings, conversations, tasks, interruptions. They push you through the hours so quickly that you barely notice yourself moving. But quiet days are different. Quiet evenings especially. They stretch. They leave room for things to rise. And if you haven't practiced being alone with your own life, that space can start to feel larger than it really is. When I finally left the diner, the air outside had turned colder. The kind of cold that sharpens the edges of things, I stood beside the car for a moment with my hands in my pockets and looked back through the window. The waitress was wiping down the counter. A man at the far end of the room had his head bent over a plate of eggs and toast. The television above the register flickered silently, closed captions crawling across the bottom of the screen. Ordinary details. But now they seemed to hold a kind of gravity. Not because they meant anything special, because I was actually seeing them. I got into the car and started the engine, but before pulling out of the lot, I looked across the street toward the office building again. The light on the third floor was still on. The same window. The same room. The figure was there again, moving slowly across the space, back and forth, back and forth. For the first time, I didn't wonder who they were. It didn't matter. I understood them now in the only way that counted. We were doing the same thing in different buildings. Delaying the moment when the day became nothing but ourselves. The drive home felt unusually still. Not empty. Just stripped down. No radio this time. No need for distraction. At one red light, I watched a young couple cross the street in front of the car. They were talking about something, laughing softly, carrying takeout containers and a paper bag between them. For a second, I caught myself wondering whether they knew how temporary certain versions of life are. Not in a tragic sense, just in the normal way things change. At some point, if you're not paying attention, the life you thought you were building becomes the life you simply maintain. And then one ordinary night, you find yourself sitting in a diner, realizing the quiet isn't peaceful anymore because you've forgotten how to inhabit it. When I got home, I didn't turn on a single light right away. I let the darkness of the house meet me as it was. The outline of the kitchen table, faint in the window light. The shape of the chair near the living room wall. The familiar stillness that always waited inside the front door. For a moment I stood there and listened. Nothing. Not a complete silence. Houses are never truly silent, but the soft, unclaimed kind of quiet that leaves room for your own thoughts to become the loudest thing in it. Usually that was the moment I tried to fill the space. TV, music, a podcast playing from my phone while I moved around the kitchen, doing small, unnecessary tasks. But not that night. That night, I walked to the window and stood there in the dark, looking out at the street. The same street lamp. The same row of parked cars. The same shadows of tree branches moving faintly in the wind. And I thought about the sentence again. I don't know what to do with the quiet anymore. Now that it had been said, I could hear the second part of it more clearly. It wasn't just about the quiet. It was about what the quiet revealed. Over the years, I had become good at moving through structured time. Work was easy in that sense. Even when it was frustrating, it told me who I was supposed to be. Productive, useful, responsive, presentable. The office gave shape to the hours. At home, there was no such structure except the kind I created myself. And somewhere along the way, instead of using that space to feel more present in my life, I had started using noise and routine to protect myself from it. That was the part one noticed too late. Not that I was lonely. The word didn't feel exactly right. Not that I was unhappy either. It was subtler than that. I had become unfamiliar with my own unstructured self. The version of me who exists when there is nothing to answer, fix, complete, or postpone. Maybe that was why the quiet felt so heavy. Because it didn't come empty. It came full of everything I'd spent years not hearing. Old thoughts, small regrets, questions without urgency, but with weight. The kind that only surface when life finally stops talking over them. I went into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. Still no lights. Just the street lamp filtering through the blinds and making narrow bars across the floor. I sat down at the table and let the glass rest against my palm. I started thinking about what my evenings used to feel like years ago. Not better, exactly. Just more open. There had been a time when a quiet night didn't feel like a void to fill. It felt like space. Space to read, to walk, to call someone, to sit with a thought without immediately reaching for a screen or a task to protect myself from it. Somewhere along the way, I had lost that relationship with myself. Not dramatically, just through repetition. One evening at a time. The quiet became something to manage instead of something to live inside. And because the change happened slowly, I never noticed it clearly until now. The next morning I woke before the alarm. The room was still dark, but not completely. That pale pre-dawn light was starting to gather at the edges of the curtains. I lay there for a while listening to the house and feeling something unusual. Not resolution, but readiness. The previous night hadn't solved anything. I still didn't know what to do with the quiet, exactly. But now I knew that avoiding it wasn't neutral. It was shaping me. The pacing in empty offices, the unnecessary delays in parking lots, the automatic reach for noise the second I stepped inside the house. All of it was part of the same pattern. And patterns only loosen when you actually see them. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. Across the street, the same neighbor was scraping frost from his windshield again, moving in the dim morning light with the same efficient rhythm as always. Usually I would have watched him for a second and then moved on. But this time I stayed there longer. Not because he was doing anything interesting. Because I was. Because I was standing still and noticing the shape of another ordinary morning while fully inside my own. That was new. Or maybe it wasn't new. Maybe it was just something I hadn't been practicing. At work, Daniel stopped by my desk before noon. He dropped a folder beside the keyboard and looked at me for a second. "You leave eventually last night?" he asked. "Yeah." He nodded. "Good. Building's haunted after 7. I smiled. "You probably just hear the air vents." "No," he said. "I'd hear my own thoughts." "That's worse." He laughed after saying it, but not enough to hide the fact that he meant it. That stayed with me for the rest of the day. Maybe more people were pacing through their lives than I realized. Maybe the reason nobody talks about the quiet honestly is because everyone is trying to handle it in private. In offices after hours, that I in parked cars, that I in kitchens with the lights off. That evening, I still worked late. But when the office emptied and the room started taking on that familiar after-hours stillness, I didn't begin pacing. I shut down the computer while the unfinished feeling was still there, stood up, took my jacket, and left. Not because I suddenly felt peaceful, because I understood what staying would mean. It would mean repeating the old ritual of postponement. And for once, I wanted to see what happened if I didn't. At home, I turned on one lamp in the living room and left the rest of the house dim. I sat down on the couch without the television. No music, no phone in my hand. Just the room, the lamp, the soft sounds of the street outside. The quiet arrived the same way it always did. At first, it felt too large. Then gradually it changed. It didn't become easier exactly. It became more honest. I could feel the familiar urge to stand up, move around, invent some task. But I stayed where I was. And after a while, something happened that I had forgotten was possible. The quiet stopped feeling like an empty room and started feeling like company. Not comforting company. Not warm. Just real. Like I had finally sat down across from a part of my own life that had been waiting patiently for me to acknowledge it. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No breakthrough. No sudden insight that tied everything together neatly. That's not how most things work. But the next few evenings carried a slightly different shape. I still went home after work. Still made coffee. Still sat with the silence. Only now I understood why those empty office nights had unsettled me so much. It wasn't because of work. It was because I'd spent too long living in ways that kept me from hearing myself clearly. And once you notice that, you start to understand something important. The things we avoid are not always loud or obviously painful. Sometimes they're just quiet enough that we can pretend they aren't there. Until one ordinary evening, through the window of another building, you see yourself moving back and forth in someone else's shape. And suddenly you understand exactly what you've been postponing. Not home, not sleep, not the end of the workday, just yourself.